There was something that was painfully obvious to me, and that's how badly Brooklyn is still feeling the effects of the horrid Pierce, Garnett, Jason Terry trade. And in that deal, we saw the Nets give up multiple unprotected first-round draft picks. And it's still too early to really tell how lopsided that Nets and Celtics trade was, because we don't know what those picks are actually going to turn into. We know Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum are the players, but we don't know how good those players are going to be. They could be anything, right? They could be all-stars, they could be future Hall of Famers, or they could be busts. But it really got me thinking into what are some of the worst trades in NBA history. I mean, complete massacres. And I'm not really talking about deals where teams have taken gambles and struck gold, such as the Bulls trading for Rodman when no other team, and when I say no other team, that includes the team that he was actually on, San Antonio, had any interest in him whatsoever. And I'm not going to include draft deals pre-1990 because it's too easy. I mean, the entire list would just be about Bill Russell and Scottie Pippen and Magic Johnson and James Worthy and Kevin McHale, like players like that, because teams, for whatever reason, hadn't grasped the importance of drafting, with the exception of a couple of franchises, the Bulls and Celtics, most specifically. They understood the value of drafting well, and there's no coincidence that they're the two winningest franchises in NBA history. So, when I think of a bad deal, I'm referring to trades where it was obvious at the time that the deal was really lopsided, and they still went through with it. So I was able to come up with the top six, which seems like a weird number, but honestly I didn't realize I had six. I thought I had done 5. So we got 6, so enjoy it, you get an extra one. And the first one will be Chauncey Billups traded to the Toronto Raptors. Now I can hear your eyebrows being raised right now. You know, number 6, Chauncey Billups as a rookie. I mean, he didn't even have a good rookie season. I get that. I understand that. But we do know what his potential was and what his ceiling was because we saw it. And, you know, how many straight trips to the conference finals? Was it 6 or 7? It was something ridiculous like that, because you got to include the one that he went with Denver. And obviously he won a championship, won a finals MVP. He was an all-star. Honestly, he will be a Hall of Famer when it's all said and done too. Now, Boston also must have seen some kind of potential because they drafted him 3rd. So obviously they didn't just throw away it. Like, why would you have drafted him 3rd if they didn't see any potential? Now, the thing that's confusing to me and the frustrating element to me was they traded him mid-season in his rookie year. I've never heard of that in any sport. A player drafted that high, traded mid-season. I don't care how disappointing. Michael Bennett wasn't traded, and he's out of the league. He didn't even finish his rookie contract. Jamarcus Russell, the number 1 overall pick for the Oakland Raiders, he at least finished his rookie season with the Raiders. And for the Raptors, who were in a rebuild mode anyway, it's not like they were trying to win at that very second. They had Antoine Walker, and they drafted Ron Mercer. They had a couple of other Kentucky guys, coincidence, right, with Rick Pitino, who just come from Kentucky. But they traded him for Kenny Anderson, who, look, I get it. He was once upon a time, he was an all-star, but he was far removed from that. He went to Portland in between, and then went up to Toronto in the Damon Stoudemire deal. And then, seriously, you traded it just blew my mind. And the results speak for themselves. As I said before, as to what Chauncey Billups was able to achieve. Just think about what kind of a backcourt they could have had they had drafted Tracy McGrady instead of Ron Mercer. So you could have had a backcourt of Chauncey Billups and Tracy McGrady. Instead, they ended up with a backcourt of Kenny Anderson and Ron Mercer. I mean, is it any wonder? And just think about how bad of a franchise they would have been had they not, struck gold with Paul Pierce with the 10th overall pick. Number 5 is Dominique Wilkins to the Clippers in 1994. Yes, Dominique Wilkins was not the dominant scorer that he once was, or the explosive scorer that he once was. But keep in mind the context of 94, and then you'll see exactly why this was such a horrible trade. Because 94, first year Jordan was gone. Obviously trying his hand with baseball after his father was murdered. And Atlanta was actually looking decent. They ended up finishing with the top seed in the Eastern Conference. People forget that, right? Because they didn't make it to the conference finals. They were bounced by the Pacers in the second round. Now, what makes this such a bad trade is they traded him for Danny Manning, who wasn't a bad player. I mean, he had his moments. But make no mistake about it, he was a complimentary scorer. He was never a consistent go-to scorer. Dr. Jerry Buss had a famous quote when Kobe requested a trade in 2007. He said, I have a diamond that's worth 5 carats. I'm not going to trade you for 5 1-carat diamonds. Now, in this case, they traded a diamond that was worth 2 carats, and they traded him for a 1 carat. You know, it wasn't enough, and they were dealt with appropriately in the playoffs, and that was their opportunity really to go to the finals. And it was disappointing to see that really get undermined by Lenny Wilkins, who never had any interest in really coaching a superstar like Dominique Wilkins, and Danny Manning was more of his fit because it fit more into a team concept. I don't know. I don't care. It was really bad. It was a horrible trade, and it cost them a trip. Honestly, a good opportunity, their best opportunity in franchise history to make it to the NBA Finals. Now, I don't know if they would have gotten past the Knicks, but they would have had a much better chance with Dominique Wilkins. I'll go this far, though. I think they would have gone past the Pacers had they had Dominique instead of Danny Manning. As I said, though, I don't know if they would have gotten past that Knicks team, but I would feel a lot more confident if my house was on the line if I had the Hawks with Dominique Wilkins as opposed to Danny Manning. The fourth worst deal is Chris Webber to the Kings in 1998. Now, it's important to note that they did get Mitch Richmond in return for Webber, who did become an NBA champion, was an Olympic gold medalist, and also a Hall of Famer. It's also interesting. You also have to take into account that Mitch Richmond was 34 or 33 at the time, and Chris Webber was in his mid-20s, and that in of itself tells you how bad this deal was. Just look at the trajectory of both franchises after the deal, and you'll see exactly how bad this was. Sacramento was a laughingstock of the NBA. Not too dissimilar to what they are now, by the way. But at that stage, Mitch Richmond was there for a long time, put up a lot of points, only made the playoffs once, and they got bounced by the Seattle. Nearly said Seahawks, and I just watched an episode of Frasier, so that's I'm in Seattle Seahawks mode. But the Seattle Sonics, it was the same Sonics team that went to the finals, by the way. And yeah, they never did a good job of building around him. However, once Webber got there, and they also picked up Vlade Divac too, drafted Jason Williams, but so he had a lot more talent to around him than what Mitch Richmond did. But Webber turned them into title contenders. And quite honestly, they along with the 98 Utah Jazz, are probably the best team, or the best 2 teams in NBA history to never win a championship. Mitch Richmond was actually cut. You know, that's how bad he was. It was just prior to Jordan returning. So that gives you an idea of how little value Mitch Richmond ended up having, and Chris Webber, 1 year he was second in MVP voting in 2001. So that was a shocker of a trade, wasn't it? Third on the list, and look, this was a really difficult one. This is one that made me, I must have changed my mind 5 times as to whether I should include this or not. But it was Pau Gasol to the Lakers, and what made it difficult was the Grizzlies really lucked out with the emergence of Marc Gasol, who was a second-round pick. So the details of the trade was Kwame Brown, who, everyone laughs at, but he wasn't that bad. He was a great defender. Well, I shouldn't say great, but he was a good defender. He was a competent defender, one of the better post defenders in the NBA at the time. And the draft rights of Marc Gasol to the Grizzlies for Pau Gasol, who was an all-star and really a very talented offensive player. And what made me include this is if you think back to what I had said earlier, like I didn't want to talk about like draft deals where you didn't know, it was just kind of luck. And this is why I didn't include Dirk Nowitzki for tractor trailer, because nobody truly knew how good these players were going to be. I mean, if Dirk was a bust and tractor trailer was the next Charles Barkley, we'd be saying that it was a terrible trade the other way. I mean, nobody really knew, but we knew at the time what Pau Gasol was. We knew at the time what Kwame Brown was, and Marc Gasol was only a second-round pick, so it wasn't even who hadn't even stepped foot in the NBA. So we didn't know any, like, as far as we knew, it was Pau Gasol for Kwame Brown. That was a trade, right? And I'm pretty sure that had the Grizzlies been that interested in Marc Gasol, they could have gotten Marc Gasol without giving up Pau Gasol. If that's the critical piece of that entire trade. So my point that I'm trying to make here is what they dealt and what they got back. Because Kwame Brown didn't do anything in Memphis, but Pau Gasol ended up becoming a Hall of Famer, a two-time champion, should have been Finals MVP in 2010, and all Memphis got back was Kwame Brown, really. And of course, yeah, they did get Marc Gasol, but that's not the reason they made that deal. So I'm not going to give... It can't go both ways here, and this is why I was tossing it up, because if I excluded this trade based off what they actually got in return, which is Marc Gasol, if I excluded this from the list, then I would have to include all kinds of draft trades which were terrible, whether it was Vince Carter for Antoine Jameson, or whether it's obviously Kobe Bryant for Vlade Divac, or Dirk Nowitzki for Robert Traylor. You know, those are a few of the ones that come to mind. But the reason why they're such... I'm looking beyond that is nobody... Look, just think about this. If we want to Monday morning quarterback it, which if you guys in Australia, I mean, I'm using hindsight. If you want to just strictly rely on hindsight, it's not fair. It's not an honest discussion at that stage, because let's use the tractor trailer versus Dirk Nowitzki example. Nobody knew he was going to be that good. If everyone knew how good he was going to be, he would have been taken first or second, and Paul Pierce would have been the only guy you could even really remotely argue for being ahead of him. And he was taken 10th, by the way. So he was even taken after Dirk. But my point that I'm trying to make here is, at the time, like, it's easy to look back in hindsight and say, oh yeah, that was a terrible trade. But at the time, nobody knew that was a bad trade. And we could have easily been here talking about tractor trailer being the next Charles Barkley or Karl Malone. And what were they doing trading Dirk Nowitzki for him? I mean, what a head scratcher, right? So if we I'm looking at it just bad trades that at the time we could be critical of, and they turned out to be bad trades. I hope that makes sense. I just rambled on for a long period of time. But I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't want to just use hindsight to determine whether this is a bad deal or not. I want it to be where we can actually say, look, at the time we could see it was a bad deal, and history has proved us right. Rather than saying, oh yeah, well, these teams should have known. Nobody has that crystal ball, except for maybe Jerry Krause. And even he made some really questionable decisions too. Remember he traded Elton Brand for, what was it, Tyson Chandler? And ended up drafting Eddie Curry? So no one's perfect. That being said, number 2 on the list is Barkley to the Suns in 92. The only reason I put this as number 2 and not number 1 is Barkley did force their hand. He had to go. He had placed Philly in a situation where they weren't winning. They had a few seasons of success. He should have won MVP in 1990 when Magic won it, but Barkley had more first place votes than him and Jordan. I'm talking about Magic. Magic was the guy that won, and yet he didn't win. That to me shows how flawed it is. There's no way you should get over the line of an MVP vote if you get more second or third place votes, and that pushes you over somebody that has number 1. It should be kind of how they rank teams, or not teams, sorry, countries in the Olympics, and whoever wins that overall Olympic competition isn't the total medals, it's who won the most gold medals. And then if there's a tie for the gold medals, then it goes to the silver medals. If somehow there's a tie of both the gold and the silver, then it goes to bronze. Be interesting if there's a tie for all three of them, right? But getting back to Barkley, he was traded for Jeff Hornacek, who was an all-star the year before. But you got to get the feeling they should have got more for Barkley. I mean, Barkley made the dream team. As I just said, he should have been an MVP a couple of seasons prior to that. And they got it, you want to talk about pennies to the dollar, they got rupees or pesos to the dollar for that one. Barkley in the next season absolutely justified it. I mean, look at what he was the MVP of the league, really changed the culture of Phoenix, took them to the finals, lost to the Bulls, gave them the Bulls punched that team in the mouth. There's no question about it. They won their first 2 games in Phoenix. But that woke up Phoenix. And of the next 4 games, Phoenix didn't just win 2 of them, but they were quite honestly unlucky to sweep the Bulls. Because you think about it, they won that 3 overtime thriller. And then it took a 55-point performance. Well, there's a lot of P's in that one, by MJ to get them over the line in Game 4. Game 5, elimination game in Chicago, and Phoenix won, right? And then Game 6, if Dan Marley doesn't airball that jumper along the baseline, it's a 4-point game at that stage. Instead of Jordan gets doubled in the backcourt, gets it up to Pippen. Pippen breaks through, dishes to Grant, dishes to Paxson. A 2-point deficit, which should have been a 4-point deficit to the Bulls, a 2-point deficit turns into a 1-point winning margin for the Bulls. So that's how close they were to running off 4 straight against that Chicago Bulls team. And that would have been all off the back of Barkley. Obviously, you got Kevin Johnson, Dan Marley, and those guys, but who was the heart and soul of that team? It was Charles Barkley. And who did they give up to get Charles Barkley? Jeff Hornacek. What a terrible trade that one was. And finally, the worst trade on my list is James Harden to the Rockets. Now, what made this one especially egregious is everyone could see this was a horrible trade, and we had no idea. We had no idea that James Harden was going to be this good. And they traded him for Kevin Martin and a couple of draft picks, so they ended up trading those guys away for nothing as well. Put it this way. That Oklahoma team had Westbrook, Harden, and Durant. I want you to think about that for a second. I know everyone sort of says it, but when you really think about it, that's when you grasp how good of a trio that was. If they were still playing today, you're talking about 3 of the top 5 players in the league, and they were all drafted. We're not talking about what happened with Miami. And even in Miami, Chris Bosh wasn't a top 5 player. Maybe a top 15, or definitely a top 15. Maybe a top 10. You might be able to twist my arm into that. Especially the way that he changed his game to fit in with that Miami Heat team. But they never had 3 of the top 5 players in the game. And I can't think of a team that actually has had 3 of the top 5 players at one particular time on the league. You might have 3 of the top 5 defenders, like the Bulls. You may have 2 of the top 5, like Shaq, Kobe, or Jordan Pippen. But never 3 of the top 5. And that's... I nearly said the Warriors, but no, not even the Warriors. No one would make the argument that Klay Thompson is a top 5 player. So not even that. And they traded that away because they didn't want to pay him an extra $5 million. Instead, they ended up with Kevin Martin, who they let go the season after, and he ended up playing in Minnesota. Like, are you kidding? That is the most disappointing... the more I look at that, right? And they did redeem themselves this offseason. I get that. But my goodness, you look at the talent that went through that franchise. And I'm not even just talking about James Harden. They let Jeff Green go for Kendrick Perkins. They let Reggie Jackson go. These are guys they traded, by the way, right? It's not like they just sort of, we could, we can't afford these. Even if they just waited with James Harden, I could stomach it a little bit better if James Harden left. If he just left. And it would have been better anyway, because Kevin Martin just left as well. So what they got back was really nothing. They could have had a lineup of Serge Ibaka, Jeff Green, Kevin Durant, Russell Westbrook, James Harden, and you would have had guys like Reggie Jackson coming off the bench. I kid you not, that could have been their lineup. And we could have, instead of seeing Golden State just trample through the league the last few years, we could have seen one of the best rivalries in NBA history, or really two of the best rivalries when you think about it, because they made the finals and they lost to Miami. So you could have had a rivalry with that lineup up against the Miami Heat of Bosh, Wade, LeBron, Ray Allen and company versus that Oklahoma team. And then to top it off, to finish it off, you could have, because they were so young, you could have had a rivalry of that Oklahoma team versus Steph Curry and not Kevin Durant, Draymond Green and Klay Thompson. It would have been interesting. Maybe LeBron would have bolted to Golden State at that point instead of, and then he would have played on that team going up against Oklahoma. I mean, don't laugh at that. He's done it twice before. He could have done it again. Regardless, for them to give up that, like, you hear all the time smaller markets say, "Oh, we can't attract free agents," and all this other BS, right? And to an extent, they're correct, right? But then for this team to have that much talent fall into their lap, and to let all that talent go, is inexcusable. It truly is. If this was the only thing that has bailed them out, has been the fact that Westbrook stuck around, because if Westbrook had not stuck around, they would have had nothing. And they made a couple of good trades this past offseason. It's the only thing that's bailed them out. Otherwise, we'd all be ripping on them, and instead we're sort of waiting and seeing if they're able to win a title or two, it'll be somewhat forgiven. But to me, those decisions. Look, I'll never forgive Joe Dumas for drafting Darko Milicic over Carmelo, because I think they could have had an opportunity of winning 3 or 4 titles in that environment. Larry Brown teaching him how to play defense, Ben Wallace there, Richard Hamilton there, Tayshaun Prince is there. They ended up trading for Rasheed Wallace, which didn't include Darko at all, and of course Chauncey Billups there as well. They could have easily won 3 or 4 titles. Instead, they won 1, and Darko was one of the top 3 busts of all time. This is just as bad, if not worse, because this was multiple decisions, whereas the Joe Dumas drafting Darko was really only one unbelievable decision. So that's my top 5. As I said, look, if I was going to include draft picks, I would. Obviously, the list would look a lot differently, but the draft is without just relying completely on hindsight, you've got to put yourself in the position of, would I have taken this guy coming out of college or high school or Europe? And if you're honest, then cool, you can sort of come up with your own list there. But if you're not honest, and you're just relying on hindsight, then you probably say, yeah, the Kobe Bryant for Vlade Divac's trade was horrible. But keep in mind, if we're going to crucify the Hornets for that, there were a hell of a lot of teams that drafted before the Hornets did. Remember, there was a 13th pick in the draft. Why is it just the Hornets that takes crap for that situation? Same with Scottie Pippen. And here's something else before I let it go. I don't want to just ramble on about drafts, but the Scottie Pippen trade is often very misunderstood. Yes, Olden Polynice was the main piece of that, but the Bulls did include a draft pick, and that draft pick was used to pick up Shawn Kemp. It's still a lopsided deal for Chicago because Pippen's career was worth a lot more than Shawn Kemp and Polynice combined, but it's not nearly as bad as what people make it out to be.